Good evening and welcome. Thank you for joining us to mark this momentous event, the virtual exhibit opening of On the Black History of Kent County and Washington College by local artist and Starr Center Frederick Douglass Visiting Fellow Jason Patterson. My name is Tara Gladden, and I am the director and curator for the Kohl Gallery at Washington College. For those of you unfamiliar with Kohl Gallery, it is the college's flagship venue for visual arts programming devoted to the study and understanding of historical and contemporary art, promoting interdisciplinary conversations about historical, social, and cultural issues of significance to Washington College, Chestertown, and beyond. Over the course of the past year, I have had the privilege to work on this profound exhibit in collaboration with Jason Patterson and the Starr Center. What began with talks about how to present Jason's Frederick Douglass Fellowship work in Kohl Gallery in a museum-style contemporary context has grown into a multi-layered, community-engaged initiative, also supported by a Chesapeake Heartland Fellowship. The resulting work Jason Patterson has created over the past 2 years during his Starr Center Frederick Douglass Fellowship, and more recently as part of a Chesapeake Heartland Fellowship, we were awarded collaboratively to complete the exhibit, is powerful, it is challenging, it is enlightening. It is exquisitely rendered in terms of formal art practice, and Jason has worked tirelessly with the highest level of commitment to ensuring the historical and social narratives presented in his works are well represented. On the Black History of Kent County and Washington College looks critically at institutional and public legacies of enslavement, white supremacy, and racism, while highlighting the experiences and achievements of African-American Washington College students and important Kent County African-American leaders. It presents a carefully curated narrative of resistance, resilience, and achievement from the 1780s to the present. The collaborative process has expanded the scope of the exhibit into a multi-layered project with many important partners, contributors, and supporters. Jason joined together with writing partner Jalen Money to craft the texts that accompany the exhibit. Money, who in addition to his formal scholarship in African-American history and culture, American politics, and environmental studies, brings a deeply rooted local perspective. As a descendant of America's founding Black families in both Talbot and Kent counties, along with a devoted connection to Bethel AME Church, Jalen has contributed generations of intimate knowledge and local wisdom to this work. We are also developing a series of community conversations, an interactive platform devoted to discussing the complex, difficult subject matter explored in the exhibit, and working with Erin Cunahan, coordinator of secondary education at Washington College, to develop publicly available educational resources. The long process we've engaged in started with talks between Patterson, myself, and Dr. Patrick Nugent, Deputy Director of the Starr Center, who has been a constant, vital ally, unendingly generous with his time and ideas. Conversations expanded to explore how we could best involve the voices and perspectives of students in this inquiry. And it grew to foster an important alliance with the Black Student Union. Support from former President Jocelyn Elmore and BSU advisor Ernika Webster led to pivotal connections with students past and present. Alumnus Carolyn Irwin Johns came to us through this alliance and has been especially generous to the project by sharing riveting video testimonials of her experience as a Black student at Washington College from 1966 through 1970. She also participated in our first community conversation, Legacies of Education and the Black Experience at Washington College and in Kent County in August, along with alumni Jocelyn Elmore and Darius Johnson. Dr. Alicia Knight, Washington College professor and specialist in African-American literature, who developed the influential course Black Men and Women, Images of Race and Gender in American Literature and Culture, has offered critical input and student connection. Another important relationship has been with Dr. Carol Wilson, who has worked with students since 2018 on her Slavery and Freedom at Washington College project. Dr. Wilson's work and the work of her students has been incredibly influential, and some of their research is represented in the exhibit. Airlie Johnson, Chesapeake Heartland community historian, has helped to implement transformative community-focused ideas, greatly aiding in the project's community connection. Carolyn Brooks, also a Chesapeake Heartland community historian, has been tremendously helpful with research, and Jasmine Castro, Chesapeake Heartland digital historian extraordinaire, has been a rock, instrumental in the building and compilation of this website. Vic Sensnig, Vice President for Planning and Policy, Chief of Staff and Chair of the Washington College History Project, has been a steady, essential advocate for this ongoing work. And finally, Adam Goodheart, Director of the Starr Center for the American Experience, has offered unparalleled support and insight from the very beginning. And I am honored to share that tonight's program includes an introduction by our Starr Center Director and renowned American historian, essayist, and author, Adam Goodheart, followed by a virtual exhibit tour given by Jason. Jason's talk will be interspersed with sections of Q&A. And as we pause for questions, they can be submitted through the Zoom Q&A pod. Thank you so much, Adam. I'm going to hand things over to you at this point.
Thanks so much, Tara, and thanks, Jason, and thanks to all of you for attending. I hope you're all well, and it feels good coming to you live from the Custom House tonight. So I'm just going to dive into the deep end of the pool here. You're about to see some images that will be painful to look at, especially for those of us who love Washington College and in some cases have spent decades or even most of our lives here. You're going to see some other images that I hope will instill pride this evening. And maybe some of the images that you see will even do both. Now, given recent news headlines, you might be forgiven for thinking that this exhibition responds to a very specific cultural or political moment. But in fact, as you've just heard from Tara, and I think you'll get even more of a sense from Jason shortly, it's been underway much longer. In fact, the finished exhibition builds not only on the work of so many at Washington College and beyond that Tara has cited, but on research done at the Starr Center and elsewhere throughout the college over the past 20 years or more, as students, faculty, and staff have explored the African-American history at our institution and in our broader region. That work gained fresh momentum last year in 2019, when we were awarded a major grant from the Mellon Foundation specifically for this kind of collaborative, creative, and timely work on African-American history and culture. And perhaps needless to say, it's gained even more urgency throughout the college in recent months as our nation as a whole has faced a moment of reckoning that we hope will lead not just to reconciliation, but to the righting of wrongs that have too long been left unaddressed. Jason Patterson's work as a visual artist is fundamentally about frames. Literally the ornate wooden enclosures that he spends months painstakingly crafting by hand. We, the viewers, are compelled to ask, what images of the past have traditionally been considered suitable for framing, and why? Just as important, who does that framing? In this exhibition, the framing, literal and otherwise, has been done by two people who do not resemble the traditional framers and guardians of Washington College's history. In the hands of a thoughtful young artist of color, Jason Patterson, collaborating with a talented young historian of color, Jalen Money, our institution's past turns out to look very different from what you might be accustomed to. Those who view this exhibition tonight and in the coming weeks will no doubt be a diverse group of people with diverse and strong opinions. That's the nature of an academic family like ours. And each one of us, I think, will be tempted to quickly look at this history that Jason has framed, reimpose our own frames upon the history it depicts. That's human nature, perhaps. But I think maybe we will all learn and grow the most, both as individual human beings and as an institution, if we resist doing that, and if instead we pay this art the respect of meeting it on its own terms and in its own frames. I believe, and I believe that most of my, just about everybody at Washington College feels this way, I believe that teaching students to study history in all of its complexities is among the highest callings of the liberal arts, especially at an institution with a history like ours. Equally essential will be the conversations unfolding tonight with Jason on this platform and on various other platforms in the months ahead, in which everyone will be welcome to share their own questions and reflections, their own framings and reframings, knowing that they will be treated with openness and respect. I'm proud of the role that the Starr Center has played in supporting Jason Patterson's work. I'm even prouder of Washington College. From the very highest levels of the college on down, the institution has given unwavering support to this project and to the larger reconsideration of our shared legacy that's unfolding as we speak. At a moment when we're all facing so many different challenges, our community is sending the message, there's nothing more important than this. And I'm honored to introduce the artist, Jason Patterson.
Thanks for that, Adam. Really appreciate it. So welcome everybody. I'm really honored to see so many people joining us tonight. I really would like to do some thank yous on my end. Throughout this 2 years of work, what I started out planning on doing and what actually became of this project are not the same thing. And it's much better than it was. And the big reason why it's much better than it was is because the people who helped me work on this project and helped me develop it. Early on, the influence and as also encouragement from Pat Nugent and Adam Goodheart, who we just heard from, really inspired me to really put everything I could into this project. With my interactions with the Black Student Union changed sort of the approach that I wanted to, and even sort of the reason why I wanted to make this work, and made it a little stronger. Even with the processes of making the artwork, our local woodworker, Robert Ortiz, who happens to also be my neighbor, changed the way that I think about woodworking and the way that I make the frames that you'll see. Again, the work wouldn't be the way it is without him. As Adam and Tara mentioned, my writing partner, Jalen Money, really, I don't know how I would have gotten this done without him. Again, the things that I thought that I had in mind were changed with the way that I worked with Jalen. And it really made a big difference for me. And lastly, I wanted to thank so much to Tara Gladden, the curator who you just heard from. When I knew that that I hoped this project, when it was finished, this was about a year ago, would be in this gallery. And this is about right when Tara got this job, and I didn't know Tara and she didn't know me. But the relationship that we built and the way that we worked together, this show turned into something that I would have never imagined, and for the better. So again, thank you to everybody who's contributed to this. I'm sure there are people's names who I'm forgetting, but I do really appreciate that this show has my name on it, but it was definitely not a one-person effort, and I'm incredibly grateful for the help that I got along the way. So what we'll do now is I will walk you guys through this show. So you can see behind me, this is one corner of the show. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic that we're in, I can't have you guys all be here and see the work in person. I guess the bright side of this is that you get the artist to walk you through the whole show. And I'll walk through each piece and give some pieces a general overview, and other pieces I'll get a little bit more in depth in. They're essentially, I'll break the pieces into three groups of four. So in between each group of four, we'll pause and do a Q&A. So when I'm talking through each piece, feel free to type in questions into the Q&A for me to come and answer, for us to come and answer at each break. Along with this being an opening and me showing you all of this artwork, what this also is a launching of the Chesapeake Heartland website for this. So this is how I'm going to walk you guys through it. I'm going to open up the website and go piece by piece and talk to you about the work. When we get to the Q&A, if you guys have questions about the individual piece, now I am on my computer, so this is this is just a screen, but I'll try to pick the computer up and walk to the piece and see if I can point things out or talk about it a little. So you do get a scene of what's actually in the space. So I'll get started and share my screen and show you guys this website. All right, so let me set this up. So this is the website that, if you look in your chat, it should be down there in the chat that Tara left. If you came a little late after she sent that, it might not show up, but it's there, and she can, or I should say that we could probably have Tara put it in there again a little bit later. Okay, so this is the website that Tara mentioned that is essentially is the place where you can go see this artwork. It is part of the Chesapeake Heartland project. It's on their website. And it was put together and with amazing work by Jasmine Castro, who was wonderful in helping me and Tara put this website together. Okay, so when you enter it, there'll be a quick overview of what the project's about. You'll have an introduction by Adam, note from the Chesapeake Heartland staff and historians and the group that's really working through that project's sort of comments on the project. Then Tara's curator statement, and then a bio about the work that I do. Let's go back there. Okay, so scroll down. Now here are all the works in the project, and we'll get started with this first one, which is, if you can see it behind me, is this one right here. And then, excuse me, this is the part that I made. So what this is this is the view from Chestertown from the White House farm. This is a 1790s painting by an unknown artist, but it was commissioned by Simon Wilmer, who you can see there on horseback. Simon Wilmer was a prominent landowner in the late 18th century in Chestertown and in Kent County. What is absolutely significant and unique about this painting are a lot of things. It is a 1790s painting of Chestertown, which is very impressive and unique. But so you can see that across the sort of horizon line. Up here at the top of this mountain is Washington College, which was a young, new college at the time. What's still significant and very important, but the darker side of it, is it's not super easy to see here, but you can see the enslaved people that Simon Wilmer enslaved while he's sitting here on horseback. What's extremely unique about these people, or about this painting and these enslaved people in this piece, is that in his inventory after he died in I believe 1798, it lists in his inventory, it lists the people he enslaved. We can kind of correspond and see those people and link those people to the people in the images based on age and based on sort of gender and the value that was put on them. So the piece that I sort of made to accompany this work was a sort of documented version of or I took a section of that, what was handwritten inventory, and put it into this piece to sort of talk about this piece, but talk about it. I formatted it as if it was a document from the 18th century in the 1790s, but I used it as a vehicle to talk about the significance of this painting to the college. And if you go to the website, I won't stick on this too long, but if you go to the website, you can give it a full read. But it talks about how this painting was in the president's office in Bunting, but then was taken down through the work and the request and solidarity of sort of spurred by Black students at the college, and then was embraced by the rest of the student body and supported. What's really wonderful is that this piece will because it's a very important historical object, will go to the Starr Center and be contextualized as an important historical artifact that we can learn from, and is so unique to the college and to this community. And I'm glad it's here, and I'm glad that we can use it in that way. Okay, so going to the next piece. This is, I titled it The Sheriff's Sale. That's essentially what it says on it. But this is an artifact that was found in the State Archive by Professor Carol Wilson and her students in the work they're doing for the mentioned Slavery and Freedom at Washington College project. Specifically what it's about, or what's in it, is the advertisement for the selling of four enslaved children. The reasoning for the sale is because it was the college acquired those enslaved children to settle a debt. So William Peacock, who lived in lived in Kent County for in the 1840s, because this was 1845, owed a debt to the college and wasn't paying on it. So when the county took what he owned, part of it were people, and to give to the college, they gave those enslaved children, or that property went to the college. And then the college had the sheriff advertise for a sale of those children. The result of what happened to them, there's no at least found record of yet. But what's significant about this piece, and why I wanted to make this piece, is because we can assume that the college had a direct connection to enslavement. When we were talking about a college founded in a slave state in the 1780s. But what's significant about this is it's a printed example of the college's connection. So it's an important part of the college's history that should be acknowledged and contemplated and thought about. And if you see through, so with these pieces, and the order that I'm going through is also the order that we're on here. So we just talked about the sheriff's sale, and that's it right there. What's next is this piece on the United States Senator George Vickers. So George Vickers, if you're from Chestertown or you spent enough time here, you know who George Vickers is, or at least you've heard his name. Vickers is born and raised and died in Chestertown. And in the late 1860s, he was one of Maryland's senators. Why I wanted to make this piece and why it's significant is essentially Vickers' sort of staunch belief in white supremacy. The text that I use, and this is an example of text that the formatting is very stylized. So if you see this top part where it's I wanted to model it after 19th century, book advertisements. I've seen these in some books where at the end of the paperback, you'll see something that looks similar to this, but it is advertising for another book. So it'll look like a cover page, but then it'll have a paragraph that gives more information. The top of the page's information is sort of imagined text as if it was something advertising in Chestertown, glorifying Vickers. But when we get down to this section, it's when Vickers was on the Senate floor in 1869 arguing against the passing of the 15th Amendment, which gave African-American men the right to vote. His argument is essentially that that white people are superior, specifically white men, and that it would degrade the country, degrade a government if you allowed black men to vote. And he was specifically arguing against Charles Sumner, who is, as we know, the namesake of the Civil War post here in Chestertown, but who was a senator from Massachusetts. Talking a little bit about the woodworking side of things, this frame was a lot of work, but it was very rewarding. The double frame aspect here was very difficult, especially when you get into these sections of molding. Trying to figure out what goes together, what doesn't look odd. This section here is walnut, this is cedar, this is stained pine, and then this is sort of a higher grade pine. And then this is a mat board window mat with some glass, and then this is a drawing of Vickers after a Brady photograph that I believe was a daguerreotype. moving along. So this will be the last one in this section, and then we can do some Q&A. Oh, sorry, I clicked the wrong one. Oh, no, I didn't. That was right. There's just some wrong text here. Okay. So this is a portrait of Henry Highland Garnett. Most of you probably know Garnett because it's the namesake of the elementary school here. When you're driving into town, one of the highways is honorarily named after him. And me not being, local, I'm from Illinois, but I certainly knew, especially somebody who makes artwork on history, I certainly knew who Henry Highland Garnett was. So driving into rural Eastern Shore, Maryland, when I saw that sign dedicating the road to him, I was a little confused. And I was a little more confused when I got to town and saw the elementary school was named after him. And the reason why I was confused is because he's kind of known as the Malcolm X of the 19th century. And he was a contemporary of Frederick Douglass, but the big difference between them was that Garnett was militant. He believed that Black people should arm themselves and fight to free enslaved African Americans, which was made it difficult for him in a lot of abolitionist circles. He still, despite that, he still contributed a lot to Black education and just the entire abolitionist movement in general. He was born here in Kent County, right outside of what's now Chesterville, just not far from here. But when he was about 9 years old, his family escaped, or at least went, freed themselves north to New York, where he grew up and sort of lived most of his life and established himself as a religious and educational Black leader. At the end of his life, at the very end of his life, he moved to Liberia, where his daughter had already settled. And because of that, he sort of requested to be the US minister to Liberia, which is the equivalent of the ambassador, and it was granted to him at the end of his life. So in the last about a month of his life, he was the US ambassador to Liberia. What's also significant about him is that he was the first African-American to address Congress on the congressional floor. He was selected by Lincoln to give a sermon after the 13th Amendment was passed. So the ornamental sort of side of this frame, or what's going on with the frame, are sort of things to sort of represent his life, or his birth and his passing. The flowers here are Black-eyed Susans, which is, I'm sure you all know, as the state flower from Maryland. And then the flag is Liberia's flag. So it's those are the two symbols I wanted to sort of associate with him. So his birth and his passing. So that is the first section. Let me unshare my screen real quick. And if you guys have some questions, I see there's at least one. I think Tara and Adam might jump back on and we can see if we can answer questions for you guys.
So there are several questions coming in, Jason. The first is from Robbie, who says, growing up in Chestertown, I'd seen the historical marker, presumably honoring George Vickers, that's next to the Dollar General parking lot. Honestly, I never read it, and I assumed he was an honorable guy, not a white supremacist. I haven't paid attention. Do you know whether that historical marker is still there? And if so, is there any effort being made to remove or change it?
I walk by it every day. As some of you know, my day job is at Welcome Home Chestertown. And my studio is right on Park Street across from the park. So, and I live on Philosopher's Terrace. So I walk by it every day. It is, if there's anything wrong with it, it's omission. But I think that there was some work put into trying to be honest. I don't think that they did it, but the wording is interesting to me. And what's interesting to me is that it highlights that he voted not to remove President Andrew Johnson from office. He was the last vote. to do that. And I think it's an interesting way to sort of let the reader decide what that means. I would obviously be a little bit more pointed on how I would talk about George Vickers, but I think the point is saying, like most people, I think there's a consensus that Andrew Johnson was a very bad president, and it's saying that that George Vickers was sided with him. And I mean, I think that might be an attempted acknowledgement, but it's hard. I mean, you want to acknowledge a senator who came from here, but if you look at the type of man he was very problematic. I mean, he was a unionist. He didn't secede. I mean, some of his children did. He had a son who was like in the Confederacy, but he was an absolute fundamental believer in white supremacy. And I mean, this is why I make this work. This is why I think it's important for us. I think it's important for us to think about these things. I don't mean like, oh, take it down and we're not going to talk about George Vickers. Like, I want to do that, but I want to talk. We should talk about him, and I think that, and then see what happens, because it's history. History is important. It doesn't. When it gets hard, we should just gotta power through that and talk about these kind of people. Adam, do you want to say anything about George Vickers?
Nope, not at all. Not him the better. No, I think you've done a great job in describing him.
He's difficult to read. He's mean.
We have several questions that have come in regarding your frames. So one question from Hunter has to do with the process of choosing the wood finish, the style of the frames. Is it random? Do you have an idea? I'm going to throw all these questions out there, and you can maybe answer them in a fell swoop.
Good idea.
Is it random, or do you have an idea in your head beforehand? Alicia says, great work. The frames are stunning. They suggest respectability, beauty, and status. Why pair such an ornate frame with an image of a white supremacist? And there was another person who asked, is there significance in your frames in relation to the history of each piece? So if you can sort of expound on, your approach to the frames with all those questions in mind, that would be great.
Yeah. So the design of the frames, I started making doing serious frame building about 8 years ago. I had a series of work that I wanted to have that was about images from the 19th century, and I wanted to frame them like frames like art in the 19th century. I didn't want to just give them gold frames. And I was watching some bad TV show, but it was a period piece, I can't remember what it was, about the Victorian era. And the design was exaggerated, and they had these intense interiors. And I was like, wait a second, I really like the way that looks. And I'm making this work about the 19th century. Why don't I try to build these boxes? Because that's really what they are, boxes that look like 19th century interior design. And then that's sort of where it went. So I'm looking at like taking the mold, like all of this is just crown molding from hardware stores. And I take that and sort of stain it in a way that would look like that, use colors, use woods that will look like, that sort of model after interior design, and sometimes architecture, but mostly it's interior design. As far as framing horrible people in beautiful frames, when I make this work, I try to think of it again, like I just mentioned, like a period piece. Like I want to think about it as if it was being made in that time period. I mean, obviously no one framed like that in the 19th century and like the 1860s, the 70s, but it looks like it could have fit there. So I really want it to fit in the time period that it is. And I want it to be in the context of how people thought back then and thought at that time. So if you're in Chestertown and you're proud of your senator because he's from your hometown, and you might believe in his political beliefs, maybe this is how you would want to present him, and that's sort of what I'm going for. So I want to just try to take something out of the past and put it here, and sort of let us think about how things were back then. There's another. What was that? What was the third question about?
The third question had to do with the historic significance of the frames, which I think you answered.
I guess I kind of answered that. Yeah, I just want them to look like the time period they're in. So when we get farther into it, there are pieces that are from the 50s and 60s, and the frame design, it reflects that time period as well.
We have some more questions coming in.
Maybe just
One question, is there any evidence that enslaved people actually worked for the college?
Ooh, oh gosh, Adam might have to help me on this one. Isn't the answer not directly?
Well, I want to let you speak, Jason, because you're the person that people really want to hear from tonight.
Okay.
But I will refer people to the terrific website that Dr. Carol Wilson and her students have put together, Slavery and Freedom at Washington College. And if I can just summarize their findings, basically they've found that although some evidence is lacking because the college's archives burned twice in the 19th and early 20th century, it's certain that enslaved people worked at Washington College's campus, as indeed they worked just about everywhere on the eastern shore of Maryland before the Civil War in various capacities, in addition to the story that Professor Wilson and her students found and you highlighted tonight of the enslaved children who were actually seized for debt by Washington College and auctioned at the courthouse. Just about, I think, the most profound and shocking entanglement with slavery that one can imagine, and similar on a small scale to the much discussed sale of enslaved people done by Georgetown University that's gotten so much national attention.
Yeah.
Another question that's come in is, this is from Lindsay. Is the recreation or presentation of the artwork as surrogate historical documents a form of wish fulfillment? How would you like these documents to be thought of? Since we give a sort of reverence to historical documents, is this a way to take control of a past that has so often been controlled by the white establishment?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I guess I'll just explain what I think about these documents. I think, again, I'm trying to get people into that mindset and take them back to whatever time period I'm referencing. And I think it's just aesthetically pleasing and interesting if I'm going to take the words I'm saying or the words other people said, whether it's now or whether it was 200 years ago, and put them into a document. Sometimes, like with the sheriff's sale ad, that's a verbatim recreation. That's not, I didn't make anything up with that one. But with the document that goes with this, I mean, the text in it is very contemporary, but the formatting is within the 19th century and the 18th century. So what I'm trying to do with that is sort of create this picture. This is where the art kind of kicks in, and I want sort of that to be draw people in and to get them to start thinking about that history. Framing it again is also is another part of that, of really giving importance to what the text is talking about, or at least present a symbol of. To me, the framing is a symbol of importance. That in our culture, in this country, you frame important things. So that's what I'm trying to say with these, is like, this is important, even if it's the horrible things that George Vickers said. It's still important, and that's why I frame the work, and that's why I create these documents.
I think there's another question that kind of builds on that same question, that asks why you stylize historical quotations and excerpts. Why not copy them verbatim? What does stylization do to or for the materials you're excerpting? Yeah,
sometimes it just would look weird, or it would be a little boring. Sometimes, for example, for this piece, this was handwritten in cursive. And unfortunately, most millennials like me, they stopped teaching us cursive, so it's hard for us to read. It's a tough cursive for this. So and then for this one also specifically, I wanted there to be an official look to it, because this one is literally like a handwritten spreadsheet. This one is I wanted it to look like an important kind of document. So sometimes when I do reformat things, the idea is to sort of place them in a way that is a little bit more digestible or a little clearer to understand.
What is the significance of the flag beneath Vickers?
Oh, that's a long one. So many of you may know this is one half, or there's two of these are one half of the state flag. Before the Civil War, so it's important to know that Maryland did not have an official state flag until the 20th century, like the beginning, like turn of the century. Before the Civil War, now we had the crest, like this is the, you know, the flag is based off of the Calvert family crest. Before the Civil War, the sort of anti-Lincoln sentiment and the pro-slavery sentiment, which was mostly the Eastern Shore, used this side of the flag to sort of represent the red and the white to represent that sort of mindset. During the Civil War, Maryland regiments that from the Confederacy but were made up of men from Maryland also used this. So this sort of became a symbol of white supremacy in Maryland. It's not really, I mean, it's not as often used that way now outside of actual like white supremacists. One of the ways that they do it is they just turn the Maryland flag upside down so that this is at the top left and not the yellow and black. But sort of, I use it in this context to sort of represent the sort of side of Maryland that Vickers was on and from. Now it's not super straightforward because, like I mentioned, he was a Unionist. So he stayed in the Union. He was like, I believe he was a general, but he was like in an administrative level in the military. But he still held every sort of ideological belief with that came with using this flag, using the flag in that way. One of the first things I was really interested in the Maryland flag and that history of the Maryland flag before I even moved here, back when I lived in Illinois. Last thing I'll say about it is that one of the significant things about it is when they were deciding to make this as the Maryland flag, the idea of it was it was acknowledged that Confederates used the red and white, Union soldiers used yellow and black. And the idea was we want to create reconciliation, so let's make this the flag because it's a symbol that already exists for us, but let's contextualize it that way. The problem with that is that's the idea of that, or that thinking was white Union soldiers, white Confederates, we're gonna reconcile. But all those black Maryland soldiers and all the black Maryland residents weren't being thought of that. This reconciliation was being reconciled under Jim Crow and reiterating segregation and racial inequality. So I'll do a lot of work, more work in the future about the Maryland flag and sort of contextualizing the history of it.
There's so many questions coming in. There's so many. I feel like some of these questions we can continue, like we can apply them maybe later. I'm just looking through really quick to try and see if there's anything we absolutely need to talk about in this section. Here's a question. Do you think it's possible for a white supremacist symbol like the white and red flag to be reappropriated? Like, yikes, that's our state flag.
I don't really have an answer to that question. I think that it should be something, I think all I want people to do, Marylanders to do, is think about its history. I mean, even if you ignore the history that I brought up, the fact that it was the family crest of the Calvert families, the Barons of Baltimore, who like oversaw this colony. And then and they had significant ties to slavery. So it still represents that history as well. What I think is important is just to start acknowledging that history and talking about it and thinking about it and going from there. I think that's all we can ask for, is people to, in good faith, think about what that history means.
Yeah, I think another question that is related to this section very specifically is a question that was about the. This question is: were the children, the enslaved children, sold right in Chestertown at the courthouse here? Was there a slave block here in town?
So it gives the address. It says it's on oh gosh, Black. Let me go look at it real quick. Black Blackston Road. Oh no, that's somebody's name. That's the Blacks Road is where it says near Blacks X Road in Kent County, as it said where the auction was. So I'm not sure where that is, or if there's a contemporary reference to be able to figure out exactly where that is.
Sorry, I'm still reading through these questions. There's so many here. Here's one more. When was the Simon Wilmer painting removed? And do you know if the process leading to its removal was contentious?
It was removed in December, I believe. And it was about the opposite of contentious, at least from my perspective, and at least between students and administration. It was almost happened too fast. It was because it was so, honestly, I think it being up was people not thinking about it. And as soon as they thought about it, they were like, absolutely, Kurt Landgraft, all the administration, it was immediate, which was reassuring. This painting is, no one wants to get rid of this painting as to hide it or somewhere. It's an important historical artifact that is such a good learning tool. And I think that this is exactly where it should be. It should just be contextualized correctly.
I think this is a really good question that I think might be able to lead us into the next section. So Lauren says, it's unusual to be embedded as an artist in years-long archival research on site. What did you learn about how what you do is different from what a historian does?
I make artwork, and I'm not in an archive as long as historians. And I'm not a trained historian, but I try to learn from trained historians as much as I can. I think I making art a lot harder for myself because I do so much of the research, but it is just the passion I have and what I want to do. I think the biggest difference is just the spending more time in archives and doing research. I do a lot of research, but I'm very close to a lot of historians, and I see where they are and what they do. And it's a lot more in depth, but I rely on a lot of them as well. I always am helped by those historians and sort of interact with them and make sure that what I'm presenting is as appropriate as possible through their assistance. But I think that the biggest part is that they do more historianing and I do make more art than the historians.
I'd like to add on to that with another question that's related. As a contemporary historian, artist, how do you deal with the issue of judging historical figures and their decisions by present day standards?
I don't think I do. I think what I do is try to put things in historical context. I think, like for George Vickers, George Vickers was a white supremacist. He would have told you that in the 1860s, that he believed. The text, he says it in the text, that white people are superior. And there are people in the 1860s who didn't think that. I think one of the things in the time that I've studied history that I've learned is that it's rare where an opinion I have about the past, that there wasn't somebody who also had that opinion. That there were people who think about racial equality essentially the same way we do, that were in the 1850s and 1860s. And I think that, and to me, that's really interesting and important, and we should talk about those people. I think that people should know, it's helpful here, but people should know who Charles Sumner is. And we should know the things that he thought in the early and mid 19th century that would be considered liberal and progressive in our time. And so I think that it's, I really don't try to, I don't think I ever really need to apply our sort of contemporary viewpoints to the past, because sometimes, always, you can find those viewpoints in the past, or you're just, at least what I'm doing is just presenting what people thought in the past and asking you to think about that.
Let's continue. Why don't we move on to section 2, and I'll see if I can integrate. There are a lot of comments coming in, not necessarily questions.
Okay.
There's an interesting comment from Arthur Leiby answering a question about where those enslaved children were sold. And he says that it was Black's Crossroads in Upper Kent County, about 2 miles east of Shrewsbury Church, next to St. Bridget's Farm near Vonnie's Restaurant.
That is super helpful. That's super interesting. Wow, that's great. Thank you for that.
Thank you for catching that, Adam.
Yeah. Okay. So getting back into this. So this piece is another artifact piece, the piece that I didn't do. And it is a mural painting of a sort of illustrated version of the college's founding, or the sort of ceremonial founding of the laying of the cornerstone. Now it was commissioned by the college in 1939 and painted then by, what was his name? Paul Roche, or Rock, I'm not sure, who was a Irish-born Baltimore painter and printmaker. This was one of the murals that was in Bunting Hall when it was the college's library. Why I think this is, I think we can all see why it's very important and very significant is because the focal point is an enslaved African-American. This is a scene from 1783, early in that year. Again, but painted in 1939, and it was in Bunting Hall. But what's significant to me about this, granted that it was through a good chunk of the 20th century was just a part of the college, specifically a part of the college that was a white only at its foundation college, depicting the image of an enslaved man at its sort of focal point. The painting scene is based off of, this is right here is William Smith, who's the college's founder. And it's based off of his description of the scene. What was a little confusing to me when I was doing this research is reading, I've read that description. I read what President Meade at the time wrote as a request of the paintings that he wanted done for the school. But in Smith's text, he doesn't mention an enslaved man. He says Governor Paca laid the cornerstone, and that's what the title the college gave it. That's how Meade described it. But the painter, Roche, still decided to incorporate an enslaved man doing it, who at the focal point, which is interesting to me. It's a little confusing to me. So it was put into Bunting in 1940 and stayed there for decades. But it is a peculiar decision to make when they didn't have to. They didn't have to. Granted, this absolutely could have been what it looked like. Why shouldn't we assume that they had slave labor performing this? But there's no written record of it, and the college they didn't have any historic obligation to present an enslaved man this way, but they did anyway, and that's peculiar to me. And then at a school who's had, sort of was white only for such a long time and has that history, do this giant mural that is a depiction of its founding, but then they center it with an enslaved man on his knee laying in a cornerstone while the governor of Maryland is instructing him on what to do. I think that's important, and that's something that sort of should be contemplated with and thought about. So moving on. So the piece next to that is this portrait and document about Rivers. Gosh, what am I blanking? William James Rivers. Rivers was the college's 13th president. It was technically it was the 14th administration, but his name's going to escape me. There's a president before him that serves twice. So he's the 13th man to serve as president of the college, and he served in the early 1870s. Actually, how I learned about Rivers was not through my research for this project, but actually I was reading the book, The Denmark Vesey's Garden, which is about slavery and sort of white supremacy in South Carolina, but mainly in Charleston, South Carolina, which is where William Rivers is from. William Rivers, born and raised in Charleston, South Carolina, was a professor at the time it was called College of South Carolina, which is University of South Carolina now. Now, during Reconstruction in the 1870s in South Carolina, like several southern states, the African-American men were able to, their rights were given completely, and they were able to run for office, hold important positions in institutions. And at the University of South Carolina, I think more than half of the college's board, or at least half, were African-American men. And one of their first acts was to allow just one Black student into the medical school. That Black student happened to be the Secretary of State of South Carolina during Reconstruction South Carolina. But even though it was one Black man who was allowed to be at the college, 3 professors resigned. And one of those professors was William Rivers, the college's president. He left in 1873, left University of South Carolina and came to be president at Washington College. 3 years later, in 1876, he goes back to Charleston, to the South Carolina Historical Society, which he was a founder of, and I believe in 1855 is when they were founded and still exist. And he gave, it was their first meeting after the Civil War. This is the centennial, the country's centennial, so 1876, and gives a speech. Similar to the Vickers text, I sort of formatted it in this way. The red text at the beginning is sort of like a formal introduction that I wrote as if it was written by the college in 1876. But the rest of it, even those the titling and everything else, are excerpts from his speech at the South Carolina Historical Society's meeting. But the sort of theme, at least of this section of his speech, was white supremacy, and that it was fundamentally for white men. And again, he was saying this as the college's president. So again, this is another example of like these histories that we should know about. We should talk about this. We should think about these things and think about how close this college, or whether it's the college, whether it's the county, to the darker side, how close our community has been to the darker sides of our history, and that we should reckon with it. Okay, moving to the next one. So speaking of the darker sides of our history, when I did this project, or started this project, one of the things when I was going through yearbooks, it didn't take that long, but I did find examples of blackface in the college's yearbooks. One of the first one I found is from 1957, where the Kappa Alpha fraternity did a sort of a mock performance of a Black church service in Smith Hall in 1957. And again, this is a verbatim from the yearbook. This is a drawing, it's a charcoal and pastel drawing, but this is how it was presented in the yearbook. So I added a frame and enlarged it through drawing, essentially. The other example is from 1961, and this is a minstrel show. I mean, that's what the purpose of it was, is to do a minstrel show in blackface in 1961. For me, the significance about these is the time that they happened in. Now, of course, blackface is common, and it was common or not common, but there are examples of it after these times. But to be a college, and especially when you're in 1961, and the college is still condoning this is a little behind. I mean, at this time, you have schools in the deeper South that are integrated, and at least to a point, and that something like this certainly has been off the table. And the text that sort of is accompanied with this also, like I want people to think about the fact that, especially with this minstrel show example, that this is at that year in 1961, Thomas Morris and Patricia Godbolt, who were the first two African-American graduates, were enrolled in students at that time. So speaking of them, that leads us to the next piece, which is the triptych I did of the first three African-American graduates at Washington College, which is Thomas Morris, Patricia Godbolt, and Shirley Dale Patterson. And I think many of you know that just recently the residence hall here was named after Thomas Morris, which is really wonderful. It's a really good thing for him to be recognized at that level. So thinking about this history and thinking about African Americans at this college, specifically students, the biggest thing that I want people to think about. So we know that the Washington College is the oldest American college. When we're thinking about colleges established after the Revolution, when the United States became a country, Washington College was first, which is 1782. Thomas Morris, as you can see here, was graduated in 1962. I mean, it took the college 180 years to graduate an African American, and that was only 58 years ago. That's significant. That's deliberate. I mean, that's by design. And I think that that's something that I want all of us to think about, and think about what it took for that to happen, and especially what it's like for Black students now. Obviously, a lot of things have changed, certainly the number of students, but some things are still similar. If you were able to watch the community conversation we had with Caroline Johns, who was the fifth graduate from Washington College, she graduated in 1970. There are parallels of the struggles that she faced and the struggles that Black students face now. And I worked on these pieces to sort of have people think about that, to realize how not that long ago is when these people graduated, but the school was founded a long time ago. So that's sort of the idea behind focusing on these works. Going back to the question somebody asked about framing and how I mentioned with time period. So all these images are from the 60s. I wanted to sort of reference, so in the past referencing 19th century design, this is sort of a reference to mid 20th century design where it's minimal. These are cherry framed, the witch cherry, and then they have a gold leaf sort of inlay. And they're, extremely minimal. And again, this is to reference that time period. So yeah, there's that section. Let me unshare my screen and we can get to some more of the questions.
One question came in that you already answered about when the first African American students were admitted. I mean, we know when they graduated, so. But there was a follow-up question that asked, what year were the first African American faculty hired?
Oh my gosh. I knew this. I mean, I know that the first faculty members that were not white faculty members I feel like there's an Asian professor in the 50s, and his name is escaping me, but I did come across that. But yeah, I should remember this, but I don't. I think it's because my mind is more focused on how the historian John Hope Franklin came to the college, and really first in 1958, which was a very big deal. And I think that's what's stuck in my head. But I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly when that happened.
I think it was in the 1980s that the college hired its first African-American faculty members. And there was a sort of a big push at the college towards sort of a progression on racial issues in the 1980s that also involved inviting a lot of Black writers and intellectuals. Derek Walcott, Toni Morrison came here. And the college also had the first Black member of the Board of Visitors and Governors in, I think, 1985.
Which was Dale Patterson, the third graduate. She was the first African-American board member.
Raven Bishop says, I think it's a typo. Yeah, 1989 was when the first African-American faculty member was hired. Some other responses said Professor On was at WAC in the late 60s. The professor you referenced, Dr. On, A-N. Yeah, another person, yeah, 1989. Any other questions? Another, Mark Schulman says, sad about the paucity of African-American students in the 60s, but let's not forget Marty Smith, 67, who went on to become a distinguished government economist.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was able to talk with him some. He's the, as far as the first graduates that haven't passed away, it's, he's the earliest graduate, and then Carolyn Johns, who was 1970.
Yeah, any other questions related to this particular section coming in? I mean, there are a lot of questions here, but some of them are like ones that have to do with what your next step in the project is and things of that nature that I feel like maybe we can hold on till the end.
Sure.
Here's a question. It says, might M. Paul Roche have included the enslaved laborer as a progressive gesture in an effort to not have the history whitewashed? That's from Ben Tillman.
That is a great question. And that is something that I mean, me and Pat Nugent had a lot of conversations about this. So that was something that I jumped to. And I mean, it's not impossible. But you have to remember that this would have been decades before Thomas Morris was a student. I feel like it would be, it's hard for me to think that in 1939 and 1940, that if college administration or if the college hired an artist that said, I want to present this painting that focuses on an African-American that's about the college's founding, and to sort of show, like, even if it's like, obviously it would be sort of like, not the best way to be progressive, but if that was still the purpose, it's hard for me to believe that the administration would go with that. That's my thinking with it. It would just be, as much as I don't understand why they even had an enslaved person, I don't understand why they would do it in a way, do it in a way that was meant to be positive and progressive. Because, I mean, there are examples from that time period where progressive people were trying to do things to sort of uplift African Americans, but kind of were doing the opposite. So it's still a thing that I contemplate. But I mean, I guess the answer is I don't know, but I would guess not.
Another comment is perhaps the African-American figure was included as an answer to rising fascism in Europe.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other thoughts that I had is that it would even, the sort of Wedgwood sort of abolitionist symbol, am I not a man, am I not a brother? It could be a reference to that because the man's kneeling, which is similar. But again, that would be a very strange thing to be at Washington College in 1940. So I don't know.
Yeah, well, another question says there's a second missing piece that pairs with this mural from Vic Sensnig.
Yeah, it's a painting of, so there were two paintings, right? When you walked in, behind you, there would be two paintings. One was this painting, and the other painting was a scene from the one time George Washington visited the college, and there was a play put on in his honor. So it's sort of like a scene from that, like on the lawn, a play and George Washington in it.
Another person asks, well, the question keeps disappearing, sorry. They say, I thought minstrelsy stopped being popular in the early 1900s, so it's odd that the photo was from 1961. Do we know how the campus reacted to it?
You're right that well, so I wouldn't say it lost favor in the early 20s. Well, I mean, I would say that it lost favor in the 60s or before the 60s. I think it started dwindling in the 50s. But I mean, you can find examples of people doing it up to now and doing it in a way that's not, the idea is the same as it was 100 years ago to sort of mock African Americans. I mean, you had Julie Garland in blackface in the 30s and other famous people. But I would guess, I mean, I think that you would not be able to do that unless people on campus didn't have a problem with it. So I think that, I mean, it says the minstrel show revisited, so there could very well be that they're thinking of it as, let's talk about this kind of entertainment. I don't think they mean it as like, but it was also bad. But I don't know. I mean, that's one of the main reasons why I did it verbatim how it was in the yearbook, because there isn't any more information about it. I went through that entire year's Elm, and I couldn't find a reference to that performance. So it is a little bit of a mystery, because again, it is 61 is pretty late.
There's a couple other questions here. One is, has there been any research on the construction of the buildings by slave and freed craftsmen? And there's another comment here that says, I'm not sure if this is related to this or not. I think it is. For an example of this, see Crafting New Bern by Catherine Bashir. Who else would have built the buildings in Chestertown? If not,
I think again, going to look at the work that Kara Wilson did with her students, I think they cover that topic. And in the work that I did, I didn't really get into that as much. But I would say that that's your best bet to go and see that. It's really interesting stuff.
I think it's important to remember when we talk about the Black history of Kent County and Eastern Shore more generally, that there was a substantial free Black community here going all the way back actually into the 1600s. A community that achieved a degree of strength and prosperity. There was really a range from people who were very impoverished and barely better off in terms of their physical welfare than they had been in slavery to other people who were successful middle-class entrepreneurs. But in many ways, as one historian has said, that state of being free could be slavery by another name. You were a working person whose rights and freedoms were very restricted legally as well as economically. And when we think about who was doing manual labor in Chestertown, we have to think about those people as well as the enslaved people who were involved, but simply because it wasn't people who were technically free rather than enslaved also doesn't mean that it wasn't part of this whole system of white supremacy that was being enforced specifically through the labor market here. So it's complicated. It's always more complicated than it seems at first, and especially when you talk about who built Washington College.
Yeah.
Another question here is, what did you discover about the Celebrating Old South Day on campus?
So that's not something I didn't get super into, and it's another example of that this project has about 12 pieces in it, and it's not nearly complete if you really want to tell the whole history of Washington College, tell the whole history of the county. I mean, it's just minute. And so it was one of the biggest things I was worried about, is like, what am I omitting? What am I not going to have in here that are going to be important? And sort of talking about the Old South balls that the Kappa Alpha fraternity put on through the early 20th century I mean, the yearbook is filled with those. And it was a project that I considered, but it wasn't enough focus on the Black history of Kent County and of Washington College, because you're talking about a time when there are no Black students. I mean, yes, it's troubling. It's talking about, it's glorifying the Confederacy, but it's not, there's not a direct enough for me in that decision making about African Americans. I wouldn't really be talking about the African American community directly enough if I was working on talking about that specific history. So that's why I chose not to do, well, it's not the only reason I didn't choose it. I mean, sometimes just, there's not enough time, but that was part of the reason why I didn't do that project.
This is more a comment. Linda Culp shared she remembers there were minstrel shows in her hometown of Newark, Maryland, in Worcester County. Her she says, my parents forbade us to attend. This was in the late 50s. Another question is, where were these free Black communities on the Eastern Shore?
The Hill and Easton was a really prominent community. And I think a lot of research is going to that right now. Adam, I think you're gonna have to remind me exactly the neighborhoods in Chestertown, or the areas in Chestertown where the free Black communities were.
Well, really the free African-American population was woven throughout the fabric of the Eastern Shore. In fact, by the time of the Civil War, slightly more than half of the African-Americans on the Eastern Shore were free rather than enslaved. Certainly in Chestertown itself, Cannon Street and the waterfront around sort of what's now Front Street was a big center for the free Black community going all the way back to the late 1700s. There are also communities, villages scattered throughout Kent County and beyond that were settled originally by free Black people before the Civil War, but they were really everywhere. There's a wonderful book called Slavery and Freedom on the Middle Ground by Barbara Jean Field. I'll post a link to that for anyone who's interested in this topic. I'll put that in the comments.
Thank you.
Any reason why the Eastern Shore had so many free Black people?
I think, so in my research, and I think this goes to most of the border states, so we're talking about Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, like the states of the Mason-Dixon line, and also the states that, the slaveholding states that didn't secede. The system of slavery was a little different. So if you're living in Maryland, your role in life is a little, this is one of the things where I try not to get out of my depth because I am not a historian. But also I think that the need for mass labor like there was in the Deep South didn't exist as much in Maryland. And so you didn't have that sort of stranglehold on the community like you did in like Georgia or Mississippi or Louisiana. Maybe Adam can add a little bit more to that, but that's sort of my understanding of it.
Yeah, this would be enough for an entire talk, if not an entire semester. In short, there are many different reasons, ranging from, as Jason has said, economic reasons where the crops that were cultivated here weren't as labor intensive as the crops in the Deep South, to the growth of Quakerism and Methodism here from early periods, some strands of which faiths were strongly anti-slavery, to simply the fact that certainly by the 19th century, we were bordering on free territories. And so simply the fact that we were close to the Mason-Dixon line, right along the Mason-Dixon line, made it harder to keep people within slavery and gave perhaps more leverage to people who were enslaved to gain their freedom and stay put rather than running away and having their labor lost completely to the local white farmers. So I posted a link to, or I'm about to post a link to Barbara Jean Fields' book that has just wonderful, wonderful history on exactly this topic. And I just posted it.
Great. I would love to move on so we can get through the rest of the exhibit. There's just one comment I'll add. Someone says local historically Black communities, Morgneck, Pondtown, and Pomona.
Awesome.
Just to add to that. So why don't we move on, Jason, and we'll get to some of these other questions when you're done.
Great. Okay, so this is the last section that I'll show. So this piece, now this is a straight document piece. It is a recreation, or it's also reimagined. This is not how the book looks, of the slave narrative of Isaac Mason. Some of you might know who Isaac Mason is. He was enslaved here in Kent County and in Chestertown, specifically at the Mansfield House, which is now the Kent Cultural Alliance headquarters that's under construction. But toward the end of his time at being enslaved, Mason, that's where he was enslaved, to the family that lived, the Mason family that lived there. So what's significant about Mason is that he's from here, and then he escaped, and then he moved to throughout the Northeast, but eventually settled in Massachusetts. If you have a chance to read his narrative, it's worth reading. It's very short, but he was a very, at times, very beautiful writer, the way he would describe scenes. So the original text, or at least the printed version that I have, which I believe is a 1960s version, like reprinting of the version it was in 1893. I think it's the same formatting, but I'm not 100% sure, is a little boring. It is as minimal as can be. So the idea is, I wanted to sort of embellish it a little bit. So this is all my design, but again, the idea is for it to look like it's from the 1890s. Another thing that I'll add about the way that I recreate these documents is I just put them through a normal printer, but what's significant about that is that the paper are blank sheets of old paper. So I find books that are from early 20th, late 19th century, sometimes early 19th century. All books have blank pages in the front and the back, and I use those pages to print work out on. The text that I took from this book, now these illustrations are about fox hunting. This section is about fox hunting, but they're not from this book. But I wanted to sort of create an illustrations to add to the scene that Isaac Mason is telling. So I won't stick on this too long, but you can go back and read it. But what's really beautiful is I believe at this point when he was escaping from Chestertown, trying to get to, I believe first Wilmington and then Philadelphia, or maybe just straight to Philadelphia. He talks about how him and his group were stopped by a hunting party, or they hid from a hunting party, and then they hid in a fox's sort of den. And then he sort of creates a beautiful analogy of what freedom is and who's freer, him or the fox. And it's a really, to me, it's the best sort of part of the book. So yeah, that's my Isaac Mason piece. Moving along. So this piece, which is the opposite, in the way I created it, the opposite of the Mason piece, where I've created it exactly how it is in the original. This is a recreation of William Still's Underground Railroad. Now, William Still was a businessman and a prominent black businessman in Philadelphia in the 19th century, and he was the main stop on the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. So he took in essentially anybody who came into Philadelphia, or he was really close with Harriet Tubman and working with her. And in 1872, so when he would bring people in, he would record their stories. He'd have them say, where are you from? What did you go through? How did you get here? And he would record all of it. 1872, he publishes that. So the book is just accounts of enslaved people who escaped the South and got to him, and then he would tell their story. I found this when I was the visiting artist at the Tyler School of Art at Temple in Philadelphia. In their archive, they have a really substantial African American history archive, and I got to go through the first edition of this, And in that first edition, I'm flipping through and I find this, and it's like, oh, it's a nice illustration. But what's specific, not only is it illustrated, because most of the stories in this book don't have illustrations accompanying them, but this one does, and it's specifically about this woman who escapes from Chestertown by stealing with her children and with 5 others, with her master's horse and carriage, but from Chestertown. So I thought that's pretty unique. That's a unique story, and I just wanted to essentially just recreate it. And specifically to me, I think it's really important. The Eastern Shore and Chestertown, this community have really important ties to national history, to important events in history. So this book is such an important part of American history, and there's a significant attention given to a story from Chestertown, and that's important. And I think that that's why I wanted to put it into this project. So that's what that piece is. So this portrait is of Marjorie Hawkins. Marjorie Hawkins was prominent. She's a nurse and essentially a healthcare sort of source for the Black community in the first half of the 20th century. So when you're in sort of segregated Jim Crow Kent County, she was an important way for people to get healthcare. And from the community members who were alive in the mid to early 20th century, who I talked to about her, really said that she was an important figure within the Black community. So I thought it was very important to create a piece, a portrait honoring her. Going back again to the framework, because we're thinking from like 1920s is when she came to Kent, and her significance throughout her life and throughout the rest of the 20th century. I wanted to again think about that mid 20th century design. So this is a walnut frame with a copper inlay. So we're gonna go to the last piece, and this kind of goes back to Marjorie Hawkins, but then also the historical, the way that our history sort of links with the national history. So this is a portrait, or it's not a portrait, it's a recreation of a sort of a small article in Jet magazine in 1955. And in it was reporting on the American Teachers Association president, who was Elmer T. Hawkins, who was Marjorie Hawkins' husband, and who was the principal of the Henry Highland Garnett School, which before it was now the elementary school, it was the grade through high school for the Black community in Kent County. And he was sort of the patriarch of that institution, along with being nationally the president of the American Teachers Association. If you guys go back to the site and read through this text, it goes more about all the amazing things that Elmer Hawkins did. And what's doubly significant about this image is that he is presenting a check with Lillian Johnson, who was the former president, but then with Thurgood Marshall, who at the time was the lead counsel for the NAACP, but as we know, would go on to be the first African-American Supreme Court justice. So this piece, I think, is one of the main pieces, even maybe a little bit more than the Underground Railroad piece, that links our local history with important national history. And that is the last piece. That is the last part of the show. Yeah, so hopefully I can answer more questions you guys might have.
Here's a question. Any insight into the education of Isaac Mason, how he learned to read and write, etc.?
That's a good question. I read the book a long time ago, and I don't remember a section where he talks about how he did that, but I could be wrong. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't talk about being educated before he escaped. Yeah, it's a good question. I can't answer that.
Any other questions in regard to this particular group of works, this section? This is the last section. I don't have any new questions coming in right now. Maybe we could return to some that are about the exhibit more generally that haven't been answered yet.
Sounds good.
One question is what you're thinking about in terms of the next steps for the project.
Next step for the project, I want to, so there's two things. There's some more pieces that I would like to make that I just didn't get to about the college's history, about the local history. But the main thing that I want to do is expand the text. So the sort of presented text, when you go to the website and see all those, that's the work that me and Jalen did. And they really just work as museum text, like what you would see if you went to a museum and stood in front of an exhibit. That's kind of the goal with that. But we really want to do more longer format, in-depth, heavily researched pieces and use the artworks as sort of a catalyst to talk about broader histories and go one by one, even as if we're writing a book and each piece is a chapter. That's sort of like with this project, that would be the next step that I really want to do, is essentially write more about this project and about this history. As far as my artwork, I still want to sort of, I mean, we're at the top of the Eastern Shore, and I really wanted to sort of like work my way down and think about and make work on the Black history of the Eastern Shore, because there's so much of it, and it's beyond Tubman, beyond Frederick Douglass, that I think that people should know, and it is right there on the surface and just hasn't been brought up, and I want to do that.
We have so many people who have questions and comments that I did want to mention that this is really going to be part of an ongoing conversation. So this isn't your last chance to talk with each other or to talk with Jason, or certainly to have conversations with this art and this history. For one thing, there's been a series of 3 community conversations planned around this show, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tara and Jason, but the first one was done during Legacy Day weekend. There are 2 that are still upcoming, so watch for details of that. Also, the Washington College History Project, which is a parallel and even larger effort at Washington College to engage with the institution's history around race and enslavement and segregation and other parts of its history. That is going to have a large component that has to do with community conversations where people come together and talk and share and study and reflect. So there will be many, many other forums. And I think, Jason and Tara, people are asking about viewing the exhibition either in person at the Kohl Gallery or how long will it be up online?
Yes, I was going to get to that question next. I can say thank you for those questions. We are in the process of investigating what is possible in terms of showing the exhibit in Kohl Gallery due to COVID policies that we have to follow on campus. So I'm hopeful we will get some movement and we will be able to host visits in some kind of way, but I'm waiting on answers myself in terms of COVID policy. And when that information becomes clear, that will be posted to the website. The website itself will be up indefinitely on the Chesapeake Heartland website, and I can post that link one more time in the chat just so that people have it. When we were planning this exhibit, we found out that we were not going back to school in the fall, and we had to make some decisions. And so we decided to reimagine the Kohl Gallery exhibit in a virtual space. What we realized is that in the process of reimagining the exhibit for a virtual space, we had to hang the exhibit in Kohl Gallery in order to photograph it properly. So now we have an exhibit in Kohl Gallery, and we also have a beautiful virtual exhibit that is as close as you can possibly get. So I'm hopeful for the future on that count.
And we're getting some beautiful comments from people writing about what they're seeing tonight. One comment, just want to say thank you for all of this. Your examination of these pieces of history is so important and more of this is needed. I learned so much this evening. Your framework is beautiful also. Another commenter saying, beautiful and thought-provoking show. Always great to hear the artists talk about their work. Thanks to all for putting this together and making it available in this time of COVID. And on that note, the last thing I'd like to say this evening is just to thank all of the zillions and zillions of people who were involved in contributing to this in a myriad of ways at this very challenging time. And we couldn't name everybody tonight, but we just thank you from the bottoms of our hearts that you're participating and you're present in this work. And we hope that you'll be very much part of this project going forward. So thanks to all of you who made Jason's incredible work possible.
I definitely echo those comments, Adam. I'm extremely grateful to have been a part of this project and to have had the opportunity to work with Jason and all the wonderful people at the Starr Center and Chesapeake Heartland and the amazing support that everyone has offered and also so many other people that I mentioned at the beginning. Beautiful work, Jason.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Keep checking in on the website. We will be announcing more community conversations soon. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, guys.
And good night, everyone.
Good night.